Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming today to our event, Diversity and Inclusion in Academia. Please feel free to ask questions in our chat, and after the questions with the discussion with our speakers, we are going to ask that questions too. So first, I would like to introduce a little bit of INET. INET is the international networking of New York City, and was founded in 2014. It's the aims of the association is to support and offer professional development opportunities for international scientists, training in STEM and in the New York area, as well as help community building and facilitate connection between international scientists. Sorry that my connection is not going so well. Our board members are scientists from the research institution in New York who are working to organize career development and social events. And we are reaching a large network of more than 900 members who are most of part foreign scientists in training. Our next event will be in February, and it will be about project managers. So please keep update the newsletter and following in our social media so you can see the specific date. Here you can find our information of all these things in our website, www.inet.com, that you can subscribe to become a member. This is something totally free, and then you can receive our newsletter. Also, if you want to be more involved and apply from the open positions in our board, you can also write us in the info@inetnewyork.com. You can also follow us in our different social media, in LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And finally, we would like to thank to our board members, our advisors board, and co-founders. And also, we would like to acknowledge all the organizations that have supported our events so far, as well as our collaborators. And now I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Lydia Borret. She is the Secretary General of Science Europe. Good afternoon, Lydia, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Good afternoon.
And also, we would like to introduce Dr. Yahaira Fortier, that is the Associate Director for Postdoctoral Affairs and Training Diversity Initiatives at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center here in New York. Good afternoon, Yahaira. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation too.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So first, we would like to know if you could introduce yourself in terms of the career path and briefly describe your job now. Maybe Dr. Fortis, can you begin with that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Conchi, and thank you, Lori, for the invitation to be here today. It is a pleasure for me to be sharing the stage with Dr. Lydia Borret from our European counterparts. And just to give a little bit of a sense how about my career and what I do, I am a neuroscientist by training. I spent about 2 years in the federal government after receiving my PhD in neuroscience. In the federal government, I was participating on a science policy program called the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And the premises of that program is to bring scientists to all the federal government agencies in the Washington, D.C. area and have them serve as advisors on science topics, and you kind of cover everything. So it was kind of a big career jump because I went from understanding a very specific thing under the neuroscience scope to be the expert in all science topics in the office that I was part of. And I think that's experience for many of the people that participate in the program. And at the culmination of my time as a fellow, I work in the National Science Foundation, as I said. I realized that my passion was really pursuing topics of workforce development and capacity building for scientists. I had discovered at that time that there was a need to help scientists figure it out, what careers make them happy with the skills that they have developed during their PhDs and during their scientific trainings. So I jumped to the workforce development area. I joined the New York Academy of Sciences for 3 years, where I led their portfolio on workforce development. And it was a very rewarding story, a rewarding time, sorry. I spent a lot of time interacting with scientists from undergrad all the way to careers in the New York City area. That's where I met Mike Venstra and Ariola, and I kind of like pushed them to create INET, which is a little bit of the beginning of the organization. And after my time at NIAS, I came to Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center to lead the postdoctoral office. And I've been doing this job now for 3 years. Most of what I do on a regular basis is administrative work to try to make MSK the best place where scientists could pursue their postdoctoral studies or their postdoctoral training. And last year, I also received a promotion where my portfolio expanded. Not my time, just my portfolio. And I have been overseeing and developing strategies to increase the participation of underrepresented minority scientists at the trainee level here at MSK. And that's like a summary of how I ended up doing this amazing work.
Wow, something amazing. Thank you so much. Dr. Borret, could you do the introduction of you and your organization, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Conchi. It is equally for me a pleasure to be here with you sharing this session and to be with Conchi, with Yara, and with Lauren. I would like to say that, well, my background is I'm a chemical engineer by education. And after obtaining my doctoral degree at the University of Barcelona in Spain, I spent 4 years in North America as a postdoc. I was at the North Carolina State University for 2 years. And then I moved to Canada and I spent 2 years at the University of Western Ontario. And I went back to Spain, pursuing an opportunity to work for the company, for the private sector. So I left the university public sector to work for a company. I worked in that company for 2 years. And then I wanted to go back to international environments, and I moved to Brussels to take up a role as what it was called at that time, Senior Program Manager at the European University Association. But it meant I was in charge of developing programs for universities to come together and agree on common policies in Europe regarding university business collaboration, regarding doctoral studies, regarding regional engagement of the universities, etc. With time, I was promoted to Director of Research and Innovation at the European University Association. And then over 1.5 years ago, I was selected to be the Secretary General of Science Europe, which is the organization that I am currently heading. And then perhaps this is an association that is at European level. Maybe I will show you a map for you to understand better where are we placed. So this is, I think you see, can you see the screen?
Yes.
This is the map of Europe. So we are, what you see, the icons, the small blobs are the members of Science Europe.
Sorry, Lydia, can you put in the presentation mode so we can
Oh,
see
I see.
again?
Sorry, yeah, because it's too small. Yes, sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, so you see the points where we have members. We have 36 members all over Europe, from very north, from Iceland to Italy or Spain, and from UK, Ireland to Poland. And we coordinate policies for research across Europe. We develop policies for legislative proposals to provide input. We gather research performing organizations as well as research funding organizations. Normally, the European Commission in Europe puts forward legislative proposals for consultation, so interested stakeholders can provide input. So that's what we do. We gather our members through expert groups that provide their experience and their views, based on which we then elaborate collective views for the advocacy. One of these fields, obviously, and that's why I'm here, I think, is gender. And we don't have now a group on gender, but that doesn't mean that we have stopped our work on gender. I will stop sharing for now. And as perhaps I will explain later on what exactly is that we are doing on gender. But that is, we work on gender, access to research infrastructures, as I said, legislative proposals, the Horizon Europe Framework Program for Research and Innovation, the imbalances in research in terms not only gender, but also other socially diminished communities. We work on research data, sustainability of research data management plans. We work on artificial intelligence, etc. So we work on a series of policies across Europe, and at global level, we are part of the Global Research Council, which is a virtual organization of research councils worldwide. And we are in charge of the European coordination. For example, this week on Thursday, we have a COVID-19 workshop. And before Christmas, there was a COVID-19 workshop in the Americas, hosted by the colleagues in Argentina. So these are the type of activities that we do also at the worldwide level.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And in your work and in the way that Science Europe is working in that case, how would you define diversity and inclusion? Maybe in Europe, I guess it's different than here in the United States.
Well, diversity and inclusion is a broad term, and it really goes beyond pure gender, female, male. Of course, that's what we know more about, because that is the more traditional aspect of it, and is the one that we record data. In Europe, we are not allowed to record data on religion, racial condition, etc. So that naturally is less well known. But what is increasingly recognized in academic environments is that when defining policies for not necessarily minorities, but for certain communities, you don't need only to look at gender, you need to look at the whole range of population that one way or another experiences some discrimination.
I see. How is it in the United States, Dr. Fortis?
So when we speak of diversity in the United States, we encompasses all the different aspects of being diverse. This is diversity of gender, diversity of sexual preferences, of sexual identity, diversity of religion, diversity of ethnicity, of races, or disabilities and abilities, and so forth. I think the definition is very broad. However, when we are talking about, in academia, when we are talking about diversity, the terminology does encompasses all of that, but the numbers that tend to be captured under diversity is diversity of race, ethnicity, gender, and what is considered disadvantaged backgrounds and disabilities. So those are kind of the numbers where people report. Something that Lydia said that is similar in the United States is like we cannot capture data on religious beliefs for the purposes of reporting. We also, all the data in terms of demographics in the different enterprises in the United States lives with the HR department, but it's not used for purposes of discrimination or other of those practices. It's more for purposes of understanding how to provide the environments where people can flourish, specifically like if we're talking about people with disabilities, like how do you assess that in order to provide accommodations for people without having to report, having them have report their disabilities.
I see. And what is the current status of diversity and inclusion in academia in the US in this case?
So we kind of, I spoke about diversity, I didn't speak about inclusion. When we talk about inclusion is this notion that everyone, regardless of their abilities, disabilities, sexual orientation, needs, race, ethnicity, all that diversities, regardless of the condition of your diverse being, you have the right to be respected, appreciated, and valued in the spaces where you that you occupy. That is the concept behind inclusion. And that's why inclusion is so much harder to measure. And inclusion is so much harder to change, because in order for places to be more inclusive, there has to be a cultural change. And cultural changes take time. And what you're going to encounter in academia is we talk a lot about diversity and diverse numbers. We don't talk a lot about inclusion, because inclusion, as I said, you have to be more intentional about developing strategies to measure inclusion. And I know you have a question coming up about some strategies on that, so I want to answer that now. But you asked me, what is the status of diversity and inclusion in the United States, especially in academia? The numbers are very low. Many years ago, the term that it's being circulated and has been used is underrepresented minority scientists. And in this terminology, it encompasses Black, Latinos, Hispanics, Native Americans, and also depending on the field, it extends to disadvantaged and individuals with disabilities. However, there are within that big terminology, there are differences. So this is not a monolith. We tend to talk about diversity as if we are all the same, and there are differences among groups, and the numbers are different. In the last 6 or 7 months, we have heard a lot about the numbers for the Black and African American community. The numbers are very low. We don't have enough representation of African Americans and Black scientists in the United States. This is true starting at the bachelor levels, and it gets worse as we hit the faculty stages. This is also true for Latinos and Hispanic. And interestingly enough, some people think that we are doing better with the Latinos than we are doing with the Blacks. And there is still a massive underrepresentation of Latino scientists in all sciences, in all STEM fields. And then the forgotten group, for me, it's always the Native Americans. Their numbers are so low that sometimes they are not even captured in the data. When we present data about scientists, Native Americans tend to be constantly forgotten. So that is just to say that I want to encourage everyone to look at the data by themselves. We're all scientists, and I could do the homework for you and present you the numbers and have you run with it. But I think it's when you mine the data, and the data is available at the National Science Foundation for all of us to go take a look at. It's when you mine the data, when you realize how low the numbers are. And I think that is an exercise that I want to encourage everyone in the call to do. If you have 5 to 10 minutes, just go and look at the numbers of Black, Latinos, Native American, people with disabilities in the sciences, especially in your field. Like if you don't want to go find all the fields, find your field, and you're going to have a reality check on how low those numbers are.
Only to follow in that question is, are there any minority group all of them that you are talking about, that are less represented than others?
Well, the Native Americans, to begin with, the data to capture Native Americans in the census of the United States, I think it's the first place where it's a little bit problematic. And then when you look at the sciences, the lowest representation of all of these groups that you're going to find are the Native Americans.
Okay, thank you so much. How is it in Europe, Dr. Borret?
Yes, well, I'll take the liberty to share my screen again, because I think it's better that I'll show you through the screen, as you may not have the information so readily available. Let's see if I'm successful. I hope so. Yes, I think so. And now I forget. Yeah, so sorry, it starts from the very beginning when it's not what I want to go is there. I will, talking to academia, let's have an example. I have several examples and they are all in my presentation that will be later made available to you all. But let me focus on these examples. That is the number of doctoral candidates that start the process to get a doctoral degree in Europe. So, and you can see here the distribution of male and female. This is data from Eurostat in 2016. There's, for the moment, no more updated data. In any case, this overall doesn't look that bad. This figure hides issues. This is a very overarching figure, and it hides issues regarding the field of a study, which I will not go into detail for the sake of time, but certainly there are a much lesser proportion of female in the so-called hard sciences than in the soft sciences. But letting that issue aside, the proportion is not that bad, and with an average of 48% of female doctoral candidates across Europe. However, when you look at the career prospects, there is a clear, much lesser promotion from women that move from plain researchers or postdocs to principal investigators. And if we, recalling my past as a director for a European University Association, we also had figures of women progressing in the higher levels of university administration all the way up to rectors. And we would get to just only 8% of women in high level positions with respect to these 50% of women in doctoral studies. So the situation is very diverse. As I said, this graph really hides a lot, but it offers you an overall picture that women have a difficulty in getting through a good academic life. We don't have that many figures of women in industry, and even less in Europe, figures relating to racial condition or religion or the other minorities that we are also mentioning here. So the availability of data is very limited, and that's why it's very important that we talk about it, because we need at least to have testimonials of what is the situations that these people are living. Maybe just one thing to comment. Apart from, how can I say, visible conditions, as whether you have a different color of your face, etc. I was once in an event in the UK where people who had suffered abuse when they were children, and not necessarily Black or any other, just white, they were also experiencing a lot of difficulties in academic environments in terms of harassment, in terms of violence. And they also felt quite underrepresented. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we really need to open up our minds to all sorts of people that it goes beyond visible aspects of your body or your physical condition.
I see. Yes, true. And why, in your case, for example, and your organization, Science Europe, choose to work in this field in diversity and inclusion? And why do you think it's important too?
Well, for many reasons. It is important for a better society. We are talking about diversity and inclusion in science because it's our field. In fact, we should be talking about diversity and inclusion in any fields. It's just that the issue is so complex as well, and we can only do so much from our sector that we concentrate on what is research and researchers' careers. But we believe is good for society because we need to advance towards a more equal society. And very importantly, beyond the physical condition, is about the science itself. We have some cases, anatomical studies, for example, where the normal models are male models. And then, for example, if scientists analyzing whiplash, that is an example that I provide in my presentation, they use male models scaled down in size to simulate the effects of whiplash in women. While in reality, doctors said that this is completely wrong because the anatomy of a woman is not just a reduced size of the anatomy of a man. So that is also why it's so important to think about female in scientific studies and not as a subset of male studies. So there are scientific reasons, there are social reasons why we need to promote integration and equality in science.
Thank you. How about you, Yahya? I know you already have a really great background about it, so I think for you it's really important. But...
Yeah, I think what Lydia said really resonates with me. My father used to say, "You don't know what you don't know," and it's such a simple phrase, but it's such a powerful phrase. I think we as scientists, if we keep bringing the same kind of perspective into the table to solve issues that impact different populations, it's going to take us longer to find innovative solutions. And this is something where diversity can play a huge role, because once you start incorporating people from different walks of life into that table, they might look at a problem with different fresh eyes and come up with different ideas than the ones that the majority in the table might have. There are plenty of examples on how adding a group of people or adding one or two people from a different background has accelerated knowledge and the production of innovative ideas to solve problems that took scientists from the same backgrounds decades to try to solve. One example that is recorded and everybody could go and watch after we finish the panel if they want is Esteban Gonzalez-Burchard, Dr. Gonzalez-Burchard. He is a scientist at UCSF. I think he's a physician scientist, if I don't recall incorrectly. But he tells his story. The iBiology team did a series of videos with him where he recounts the story of how he got interested in science and the value of diverse voices in science. And he tells the story about when he was training in the Boston area. I can't recall the specifics, but he entered a room of people who were trying to understand why asthma was being affected in certain parts of the East Coast and California differently. And they have been at this problem for years. Like all the scientists in the room, all the physicians couldn't come up with like a reason why the asthma in people was so high in those two places. And Esteban entered the room and he looked at it and he's like, "Oh yeah, it makes sense. California is full of Mexican and the East Coast is full of Puerto Ricans. There you have it." And it took him just like 3 seconds to come up with a hypothesis and then allow people to look deeper to see if his assumption was correct, and indeed he was correct. Then they understood, like by doing a lot of studies, it became very clear that genetically speaking, the Mexican population and the Puerto Rican population in those 2 places were more prominent to not respond to the asthma treatments that were tested in white people, and it was significant, and it took one person to come up with an idea. And there are plenty of examples like this in the literature that shows that how important it is when you incorporate diversity of voices. There are also studies that shows that when you have the most diverse teams, that's how innovation happens fastest. So again, we are people of data. If you're looking for the data is out there for us to find. Lydia also mentioned the gender data. Imagine if the sciences were still excluding women from a lot of what was happening, where we be today. So just think about the things that are very obvious and think backwards and see progress in the last 50 years have been made because the number of women in science has been steadily increasing. We are not near to where we need to be, but at least having voices of women in the room are probably gonna provide new ideas on how to solve all issues. And I think that's the biggest argument that I will make when it comes to diversity.
I see. Great. And what do you think is the most challenging aspect of working in diverse working environment, as in academia, for example?
What is the most challenging aspect of
working in a diverse working environment? For example, in academia, here in Memorial or United States, there is a lot of diversity, or seems like there are more diversity in one place than others. But what do you think that it will be a challenging aspect? Why people think that there is that kind of problem in academia?
I'm trying to understand the question. Why is it challenging to do diversity work? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. So, I just want to make sure that I answer the question. So I think one of the biggest challenges is a lot of the diversity and inclusion work is invisible. A lot of the things that have to be put in place in order to make our spaces more inclusive and equitable and diverse, it's work that is not compensated, it's work that doesn't happen overnight. And scientists, we are always in a rush for quick solutions. We want institutions and we want experts in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusions to just tell us the thing that we need to do, so tomorrow everything is different. And it doesn't work like that. There is a lot of cultural change that is going to take decades. It might never happen because it takes changes in behavior of people in order for us to achieve some kind of accomplishment in the space of diversity and inclusion. That's one. And the second one that I will mention is we rely a lot on data, and I think that's great. I think scientists, the one thing that I always hear when people are new to this is show me the numbers, like, oh, show me there is a problem with numbers and data. And I think that's great. That's how we train, that's how we think. But there are places where the numbers are not as valuable, or the numbers might not mean anything. For example, if we talk about inclusion, how do you measure inclusion? How do you measure that a place could be 20% more inclusive? It's a hard thing to come up with. However, they are experts that we tend to overlook in the sciences, and I'm calling my social scientist colleagues that have done magnificent work on how do you understand inclusive practices, how do you incorporate equitable strategies in your hiring practices, in your recruitment practices. And I think the direction where we all should be moving is how do we collaborate with organizational psychologists, social scientists, anthropologists, in order to come up with strategies that will help us achieve real goals in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Cool. What do you think about it, Dr. Borret?
Well, I was thinking about bringing a different angle about the most challenging question you posed. One of the, my view, one of the main challenges that people, women and others face is, I think, the research assessment. Because the career of a researcher is made through assessments. I think it's the career where the professionals are researched more than in any others. They are constantly assessed, researchers, be publications, being any type of outcomes. Let me show you, for example, one other graph to show how we know or we don't know what is underlying in research assessment. I have here this figure that we, sorry, again, it goes from to the beginning. Oops, that one is about what is it that institutions pay attention when research is assessed. So you can see here in the figure the several biases, potential biases that institutions take into account. So apparently gender is quite taken into account because there are 82% of institutions that do have gender in mind when they perform assessment studies. Disciplinary biases are also part of the assessment, and this is important not so only for the discipline itself, but as we know, there are much less women in so-called hard sciences than in the soft sciences. So they are also subject to disciplinary biases, in addition to perhaps suffering biases due to gender. Institutional affiliation, the perception of where that person comes from, the seniority is a bias, a negative bias towards senior researchers, bias towards ethnicity, bias towards disabilities. And you can see that these are less and less taken into account in institutional policies. I showed all these to flag that research assessment is such an, it kind of concentrates all the biases, because as the assessment is made through panels, and every panel list, consciously or unconsciously, brings his or her own biases, that really determines the career prospects of the individuals. And I think that as much as institutions, at least in Europe, are developing policies for diversity and inclusion, because we must recognize that this is a fact, other measures should be necessary so that those panels that are in charge of assessing the research proposals or the research achievements for a certain person to promote further that person in researcher careers should be trained to not to let their own biases come through when they are assessing researchers. So yeah. I think research assessment is a very serious issue to work on, to minimize the negative effects on individuals.
Yeah, thank you so much. I only want to do like a personal question a little bit. Have you ever personally faced any issues through your career path related with diversity, inclusion, or equity? Dr. Borret, please.
Me? Okay, sorry. I have been very fortunate. I have never experienced this in academia. I only experienced this once in the industrial sector, and it was when I applied for a job and they didn't give it to me because I was a woman. That was a very tough experience, and I'm very lucky in a sense because it's my only one bad experience. As for the rest, I have never suffered from that, so I believe. No, I never felt mistreated by male colleagues or by anybody. No, I have not experienced that.
I see. What about you, Dr. Borret? Sorry, Dr. Fortis.
I have. I think so. Just to put it in context, I am an American that happened to have been born in Puerto Rico. So my first language is Spanish, and I came to the U.S., the mainland U.S. educational system for graduate school. So I didn't have all the historic context on how minorities are treated going up the educational pipeline in the United States, in the mainland again. I only had the context of how it is in the United States in Puerto Rico, which is what I was very familiar with. So I always tell people that I didn't know that I was a minority until I came to grad school. Because in Puerto Rico, no matter what your race is, you're always Puerto Rican. Like for the majority, you're Puerto Rican. Yes, we have international students, but we don't go about it the same way that we go about it in the mainland. And I think for me, understanding that I was a minority and what the term meant, and the fact that when I enter a room, people make a lot of assumptions about who I am based on how I look and how I talk. So I think that's something that took me some learning to basically understand. But I missed those first couple of months and years because I was very naive. So I navigated every interaction with people that had a lot of assumption with my naiveness as a weapon of protection. And I didn't get hurt. But once you learn, you learn. And then every interaction that you have that is testing your capabilities or is full of assumption, it could bear a heavy weight. Microaggressions happen in every aspects of academia, and some of the microaggression is because you are a woman, some of them are because you're young, some of them are because you are X or Y. Microaggressions comes from your peers during jokes. It comes from your boss, from the leadership. It comes from places where it hurts. Like sometimes there is a set of microaggressions that you could always predict, and there is a set of microaggressions that you can never predict, or macroaggressions. And I think for young scientists, it's very daunting to constantly have to prove yourself over and over that you have what it takes to be there, that you are there because you have a value to add and not because you are a number or because you check a box. And so in terms of my personal experience, yes, I think from day one of grad school, even to these days, I experienced microaggression from many places. And now I think I have the maturity to detach from many of those. Sometimes they get to me, like they probably get to a lot of like very people in senior positions still. And what I tell to people is what you do with those situations is what could make a change. For example, if you invite me to a table because you want to tokenize me and you want to bring me as a Latina woman, you're going to have to hear the Latina woman. And you're going to have to hear all that I have to say based on my experience and knowledge. And I'm going to take that opportunity to try to open doors for the ones that come after me. And yes, it's a heavy way to feel tokenized, but the way that I have learned to cope with it is a little bit thinking, what can I make out of this to make it an opportunity, and detach a little bit from the heavy weight of having to feel like I am a quota or I am a token. And it takes a lot of work on a daily basis. I will say this, it takes a lot of work. And I feel like the international community sometimes also identifies with these because they also are victims of microaggressions by people that don't understand their context or their culture. So in that, what I will tell people is detach the message from the messenger. That's how I always go about it, and try to make the most out of opportunities that might come to you because you check those boxes.
Thank you so much for such a good information from both of us. Let's talk a little bit about the solutions. What actions could be implemented in this case? For example, Dr. Fortis?
Individual, institution, agencies, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, let's take first like institutional, and at the end I would like to also for the PhDs and the postdoc and the PIs, what kind of things they can do also to implement that.
So as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, that is not a quick solution. Like I don't have a guidelines book that I can just deploy to institutions and then in 2 weeks they're going to solve diversity and inclusion issues. But what I will say is the institutions in the United States and probably as well in Europe have a unique opportunity now to look at the resources that they have in-house in trying to come up with team of people that might provide strategic advice and strategic direction in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. One place to start, if you ask me, I will say is recruitment committees, recruitment at the very basic level, graduate school, all the way to faculty level. We need to start looking at what are the inclusive practices that exist and the equitable practices that exist for us to assess candidates. There is, I don't know how many of our participants have sat ever in an admissions committee, but there is a lot of bias that we deal with because the process is not empiric. Like there is a lot of room when we talk about what meritocracy is. There is a lot of room when we talk about the best of the best. And I think that is based a lot in your perception as an individual and the perceptions that sometimes we put in the names of an institution. I always tell people, I have heard comments such as like in admissions committees, I have heard comments say, oh, I don't know what that institution is. And that comment is very charged with a lot of assumptions. The fact that you don't know what an institution is or is not speaks more about you than it speaks about the institution. And what people do is they rely in what is familiar to them. And unfortunately, what is familiar to them tends to perpetuate the gap in knowledge. So we tend to go for the Ivy League schools. We tend to go for the prestigious names. And that put people of color and women and other minorities at a disadvantage. And I think a way to do it is, how do you do a holistic approach to the whole admissions committee, where it's just not based on what school did you go to, but more of like how productive were you, where did you, what kind of studies did you publish, not even where, because we also know the whole journal world, it's very skewed towards impact factor. But how can we be more strategic about the way we do recruitment practices and admission practices? I think that is a really good place to start. And I think at the individual level, you asked me, I think at the individual level, we all have to unlearn a lot of what we have acquired over the years of training. I think we have to assess and constantly reassess our own assumptions. We need to start forcing ourselves to look with critical eyes to places that matter. For example, if you are organizing a panel, instead of having someone from the outside saying, hey, this is a manual, all the people in this are men, you need to start looking at that with critical eyes. And you need to start questioning yourself, why did you overlook certain individuals for those panels? And I think that is a process that is very hard to do. But if we all try our hardest, I want to be optimistic in thinking that some small change at the individual level could happen that way.
I see. Thank you so much. Dr. Borret, could you add some advice too for this question?
Sure.
Please?
Yeah, I will start by indicating institutional measures from my perspective from Science Europe and the experience we have with the research funding organizations, so big bodies, big national bodies funding lots of research, and also national performing organizations hosting thousands of researchers. So I think that from that perspective, the institutional leadership is key. The way they issue public statements, or the way they make public their equality policies, their inclusion policies, that is of an enormous importance, because that permeates one way or another through all the structure and through all the processes within. Our organizations in Science Europe they, as I said before, they perform assessments all the time, projects, researchers, etc. And that links with what Yayara said about their assessment. And indeed, the way they they conceive panels by including or making it mandatory to include at least women, if not more, to achieve some gender balance, to look for the minorities that should be represented in those panels. That can only be reinforced from the institutional leadership. No institutional leadership, no progress, at least for now. I hope that in the future it will be different. But for the moment, that is the reality. There is how they kind of assess and reassess, also linking with the Yayara's point, how they assess and reassess those policies, and they adapt them as we know more, as there are more studies on how these individuals should be integrated in a better way in the society, how to train the people in the panels. So I think the institutional angle is of paramount importance. At the same time, there is a bottom-up responsibility by the community of researchers to demand, in a good way, also that this diversity and inclusion gets all the way up to the institutional leadership. It's, I think, by creating this circle of kind of top-down, bottom-up interest that the whole system can get better. And I cannot stop by saying what I always say when I talk about gender and other discrimination: education, education, and education. Starting, we are, of course, here addressing, let's say, a higher level of academic research, but this all starts in primary education. And we cannot make enough efforts to teach the youngsters, the toddlers, about the importance of equality and inclusion from a very early age. This is the future solution. This is the sustainable solution.
Thank you so much.
Conchi, if I can add something very quickly, I will also, I think Lydia just inspired me, remind me of this. I think it's also important to compensate the work that is done in this space and bring value to it. A lot of people of color are the ones who end up doing diversity and equity and inclusion work because we share the communities that we represent, and because we have really strong attachments to try to do it better for the next generation. And what ends up happening is then you have people that were hired to do science, are going to be evaluated under in the science, but they encounter themselves in this position of having to do both work, because for them it matters a lot, and that work is never compensated. It's not considered for promotional packages. It's not considered for going after grants. So I think in order to make this work of value for everyone, we should start moving in a direction where this work is compensated, and the researchers that engage in it receive the visibility and the compensation that they need in order to keep doing this work.
Thank you so much. This is so great. Let's continue with the question from the audience. Lori, please.
Yeah, so we have some questions from the audience. The first one is from Olivia, and she's asking, have there been any changes in the way people see gender diversity in science as our idea of gender expands and there is more representation of trans and intersex individuals? I can ask Dr. Borret about that question.
Yeah, no problem. I don't know about the trans and intersex. I don't know the details, but what I am witnessing, at least on the European side, I have witnessed for the last at least 10 years, big changes in the way gender and diversity in science is perceived. I really have seen that. I've seen in universities, in research centers. 10 years ago, it would have been impossible almost to find one institution with a good gender policy balance, list. It was starting then, but now at every institution has gender policies, which means a change in the attitude. Different matter is how to reinforce those policies, but it's all a matter of time and it's all a matter of progress. Yes, there are ways, and as I said, there is an evolution. First of all, in gender, is the bias, the best well-known bias, but there progressively we are getting into all sorts of biases. So I do think there is a positive evolution towards awareness of the possible biases and discriminations.
That's good to know. We are going a little bit over time. I hope it's okay for the speakers, for Lydia and Yahara.
I have time until 7:30.
Okay, perfect. I have a question for Yahara. It's from Tariana. How can students and postdocs work with their diversity offices to help the offices achieve their goals?
So I think it's very individual. As I said, a lot of the work that happens in this space is very invisible and it's work that it's not necessarily compensated. So I'm always cautious when I encourage postdocs and students to engage in the work. I think more than how can students engage, I will say it's more up to the diversity offices to provide them with the tools so that they can be successful and protect their time and advocate for them when they are engaging in this type of work. Okay,
thank you. And there is one more question from Martin. It was wondering how academia could become more attractive for students from low-income families. And this person was saying that science tends to be a little bit uncertain with respect to future income. And the idea is that maybe also contribute to why a lot of scientists come from relatively high income families. So I don't know if it's true or not, or like, what are your thoughts about it? We can start with Yahara and then maybe Lydia can.
So this is an excellent question. I wish we have like another hour to talk about this, because part of the problem when we are talking about low income families or low socioeconomic families, I think part of the problem is that, and I'm speaking about the US, the system is set up in a way that they are education inequalities from the first grade all the way to college. So we talked during this panel about inclusion and about diversity, but we didn't talk about equity. And part of the problem is not so much about going into a classroom with families of low economic status and tell them how amazing science is. That's not going to cut it. There are some education inequities that have happened that put these people as a disadvantage when they are competing around against their peers for positions. There is also a lot of hidden knowledge that we have in sciences that it's not passed to people that don't belong, quote unquote, belong in the sciences. So I think part of the efforts when we talk about inspiring people of color and people from low income families, we think about this as like, oh, they don't get exposure, they don't know what science is, blah, blah, blah. But we also tend to forget that of those inequalities that have set them almost to fail from the beginning. And the way that I approach it is, it's not enough to just go and do an intervention. That's how I call it. There is a lot of scientists that say, we are going to go into a inner city school and inspire kids. And they go there for 2 hours and do their job and they feel great and nothing happened. Because it's an intervention, like you went in, you went out. And in order for you to really have an impact in people, it has to be sustainable. Like talking to a kid for 2 hours and telling them, you could be a scientist like me and it's awesome. It's not going to cut it. You're going to have to establish a relationship, build trust, answer a lot of questions, understand the inequalities that that person or that group of people have experienced, come up with creative solutions on how to help and make that more equitable. And maybe you might have moved the needle a little bit in the right direction. And that takes years. Impact, it's also very hard to measure in this classroom. we could do pre and post assessment and feel good about ourselves because they learned something. But you in reality are never going to understand if that one-time interaction that you have was transforming and life altering in an individual or in a group of people. So I think I will leave it there. I'm very passionate about this topic because a lot of people raise their hands and say, I want to do more, I want to inspire kids. And I think all of that is great. But there is a lot of knowledge in the field of outreach and education and contextualization of sciences that we overlook when we are just excited to go and inspire kids to do science. And then there is a question, the part in there that talks about financial security. Yes, that is a big issue. I have heard a lot of people make assumptions about people from low socioeconomic status and what they want. It's like they want money and they want it quick. That is an assumption that we make. And I think we also have to unlearn a lot of like these assumptions that we have made about people from different walks of life.
Thank you, Yahara. Lydia, what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, Yara's points are all very, very sound. Maybe from my part to add, indeed, this question is a super interesting question because it addresses both key issues, the access to education and research, and the future is the uncertainty of the profession as a researcher. And they are both super important. Access to education, access to research, it is, at least in Europe, a constant preoccupation of governments that often draw measures for minority parts of the society that are really, really deprived, very poor. And as Yahara was saying, actions on that level are very tough because you enter communities that almost are condemned for the rest of their lives, and it's very difficult to get them out of there to raise interests in even going to school. Let's not even think about research. However, hope is there as well. I know of cases of universities that have and are establishing campuses in particularly deprived areas. So they can develop a long-term relation with communities. And they can engage in the neighborhood, with the neighborhoods. And that is aimed at bringing into areas that would never have the slightest sight of what a good education center can be, to be there as part of their daily lives. And we hope that this, which is perhaps an emerging trend, is not really a consolidated trend, will be a way to start providing this long-term perspective that you have to have when addressing these communities. Number two, the issue of the uncertainty of the research careers, that is linked to the assessment that I brought several times during the talk, because to go from one grant to the next, you go through an assessment process for sure, and you get to your early 40s, and you're still from grant to grant, and it's sometimes very difficult to secure a long-term, even not even high, but at least stable income, with the consequent difficulties to raise families and to really live a normal life. So yeah, this long-term perspective for a research career is also a matter of concern of many governments in Europe, and also at European level. The European Commission is constantly trying to encourage member states to define policies for career progression, where researchers can find ways forward in a more stable way than just moving from grant to grant. It's a long-term process, super difficult question. It requires another debate.
Yeah, of course. But from what I heard today is that there is a lot of issues, but there is a lot of hope as well, and a lot of people are working for things to get better. So it's nice to hear.
Laurie, if I can add something very interesting that has happened is like for decades, people of color, Black people, Latino people, Native Americans, we all have been raising these points and making suggestions on how these things could improve the system. And those words landed in empty ears. However, in the last 6 months, now there is a movement where the entire scientific community has ideas that are the same ideas that were brought up 30 years ago, but now we're listening. So I think we have to capitalize in the moment that many people are looking at diversity and inclusion with a big magnifying lens. And I think if we are to enact change, we are at a moment where some things could happen, and we should capitalize on that momentum. That's at least on the United States, and I hope I'm also a reflection of what could be happening in Europe as well.
That's true. I will pass the mic back to Conchi. So yeah, thank you so much for attending this event. Conchi, let's.
Yes, thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Borret and Dr. Fortis, because that's an amazing discussion and it's really inspireful to listen to you. I only want to ask if you have any last advice, last word for the audience. And again, thank you so much for everybody for coming today. Dr. Borret, if you want to begin.
Well, a last advice for the audience. I think that we all have to take our part of responsibility to make a better society that is more inclusive and, above all, more respectful. We need a lot of respect in our society from the part of everybody. And I think that having a high standard for ourselves in terms of integrity, respect for ourselves and respect for others is the best recipe to make that better for everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Fortis.
I think for me, what Lydia say resonates very heavy with me. I also think that I am very hopeful that scientists are in a position of constantly relearning things. I think with new things and then new knowledge forces us to adapt knowledge on topics of science and medicine and solutions. And I really hope that this is the same mentality that we apply to the work of diversity. It's like, how can now, based on new knowledge, new perspective, listening to our peers, how can we relearn some of the things that were set in stone in our brains or that we acquire through different channels? And I think we are all responsible in this. It's not Black people's job to fix the diversity equation. It's not Latinos to fix the diversity. It's not the work of women to fix the gender gaps. I think it's everyone's job. We have to want to do better. We have to be intentional. I think that's something that I always tell people. It's not enough to just notice and keep going with your life because it doesn't affect me. I don't have to deal with it and I don't want to engage. But how can you also be an advocate? How can you be an upstander in the instances where you witness discrimination or harassment or microaggressions? Like, I think it's up to everyone to start putting themselves in those positions and say, it's not okay. It's not okay for me to crack a joke about women or crack a joke about Muslims or like all of that. I think we all have to want to do better in order for us to move together as a community.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody for coming today. See you next time.
Thank you very much, Conchi, for the excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Yes.
Bye.
Bye, Lydia. Thank you.
Bye, Yara. Bye. Bye, Lori.
Bye.
Bye, Lori.